Hey everyone, this video is going to be on the transition from monarchism to democracy, and more in particular how democracy should not be mistaken as a step forward for freedom, and as more often than not, the legislative powers of the state being expanded from a small elite to everybody through the democratic process is seen as liberating rather than enslaving. Moreover, even as late as the 1800s, republicanism was seen as a far more violent and barbaric alternative to monarchism, primarily for its far more expansive foreign policy, its disrespect for the church, and its socialistic and egalitarian tendencies. Thus, this video is going to explore some of the reasons this was. Now, I made a video some time ago on anti-democratic thought that, for some reason, given how I wanted to go about my channel back then, I had chosen to make from a non-ideological perspective. I wanted it to be a video that didn't smuggle in libertarian ideas, so I got a few comments by people telling me to read Hopper, and I have been reading Hopper's work for some time now, and I thought I'd take the time to talk about his ideas. So this video is essentially based on Hans Hermann Hopper's text, Democracy, the God That Failed, as well as some excerpts from Bertrand de Jouvenel, other writers during the times of monarchical rule, and various articles on Mises.org. But that being said, when we're talking about the decivilizing nature of democracy, we also need to understand some basic economic concepts. So we will begin with explaining the concept of time preference. The transition from the age of monarchic rule to the age of democracy and republicanism is so frequently recognized as one of the greatest leap forwards in human history, even to the point that it is a heresy to deny the universal and hyper-inclusive doctrine of democracy we now see all around the world. Although the first assault on monarchism was in France under Napoleon, this outlook spread to the worldwide scale in the aftermath of World War I, a war which very much signified the end of traditional forms of government. As of 1914, only 3 republics had existed in Europe: France, Switzerland, and Portugal, while Britain also had an elected parliament. Yet, in only 4 years, the United States would enter the Great War and effectively end the era of sovereign kings and bring about a new era, the era of democracy and republicanism. Thus, naturally, World War I was an ideological war, not as much fought over territorial objectives and scarce resources, but a violent battle of ideas between America's democratically elected president, Professor Woodrow Wilson, and the Austrian monarch Emperor Franz Joseph, and, Austria lost. The United States had won, a government that had only fully realized its democratic principles inherent to the doctrine of republicanism through the destruction of the Confederacy by the vastly more centralized and democratic Union government. And this notion of expansionary democratic rule embodied itself in Wilsonianism. This, combined with Tsar's Russia coming to an end, a major US ally turning democratic, further solidified the war as an ideological conflict between good and evil, a narrative that parallels with all conflicts perpetuated by the United States for the purpose of spreading democracy. But nonetheless, as is the nature of ideological conflicts, there is no objective for peace, only to subject the opposition to endless humiliation and punishment so their belief system can never reproduce itself. So subsequently, Germany gave up her monarchy. The country was demilitarized, the German Saarland was occupied by France, and the East by Poland, and moreover the new German Republic was heavily burdened by reparations. However, Wilson did not intend on destroying Germany. This fate was reserved for Austria. The empire was dismembered with the deposition of the Habsburgs through the creation of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and reducing the once monarchic superpower to its German-speaking heartland, while also taking the German province of Southern Tyrolia and giving it to Italy. And thus Austria was removed in its entirety from the stage of global power politics, while the United States and its democratic principles would triumph, reasserting itself in World War II, another ideological conflict, and then dominating even more so with the collapse of the Soviet Union, even though its collapse was simply the consequences of socialism rather than the triumph of democracy. Thus, it seems to many that by the 1990s, the end of history had arrived, and although the great intellectual and economic productivity of the traditional monarchies, specifically of the Viennese under the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, These moments in history were remembered only as a point of interest. There is no causal link made between the pre-democratic governments and the rise of great minds such as Ludwig Boltzmann, Rudolf Carnap, Karl Popper, Karl Menger, Eugen von Bombowerk, Otto Weininger, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and dozens more. Yet, even through democracy, the supposed end of history has spread all around the world. It is hard to deny that with democracy has come a stagnation in real wages dating back now 50 years. Many places in Western Europe have seen upwards rates of unemployment. Public debt has risen exponentially, even past many countries' GDP. Social security, such as Medicare, is out of funds, and moreover, this video will be constructing an a priori theory that allows one to deduce that democracy is leading civilization into a deep crisis, while the nature of traditional pre-democratic governance is one vastly less antithetical to libertarian ideals. Now, it must be noted that all governments, by definition, being a monopoly on the predation of private property, mark the process of decivilization, as government is dependent on expropriation to get its wealth. It should be expected that all governments expand as they are incentivized to expropriate whenever and however they can. However, different governments have different rates of decivilization. The way a government is organized can affect its decivilizing forces on different levels. For instance, one can say with high confidence that the process of lowering rates of time preference, that is, an increase in the rate one is willing to forego current goods for future goods, is the process of creating civilization. In other words, a fall in the rate of time preference is the change from barbarism to civilization. To explain briefly, although there are fluctuations in how willing someone is to exchange present consumption goods for future capital goods across society, it is always the case that there is a greater sum or value of potential future goods than the present ones the saver is exchanging. If the only difference between a future and present good was time, then the consumer would always pick the present good. On Crusoe's island, if time was not a factor to consider, then he would not first create a fish net, but rather would try and construct a gill net or some more advanced contraption. But as the human condition demands that we constantly consume resources, we choose to consume now rather than later. To illustrate, if you could get paid $20 now or $20 in a month, every person, no matter how high or low their time preference, would pick sooner rather than later. But if you could get paid $20 now or $40 in a month, perhaps some or most people would pick the $40, while people with higher time preference would pick the $20. While even still, if you could get paid $20 now or $100 in a month, about everyone would pick the $100. Now similarly, as the saver continues to exchange present goods on the assumption that doing so will create a larger supply of goods in the future, the instances that this assumption is correct lowers the marginal utility of present goods, lowering the time preference of the saver. They will begin to save more, and their future income will constantly rise, and thus their time preference will constantly approach zero without ever reaching it in an exponential fashion. Moreover, on a societal level, the low time preference savers and investors will lower the time preferences of non-savers. As capital goods accumulate, then the scarcity of labor will also increase, as workers become more productive with more technology and capital, thus increasing wages. And as increases in present income also lower time preference, and an increase in wages implies an increase in present goods for non-savers, individuals that at one point were not saving and investing will begin to do so. Thus, with the increase in savings and income, healthcare, nutrition, life expectancy, and technology increases. Thus, lowering time preferences mark the process of civilization. As with lowering time preferences comes an increase in capital goods, while also, as the saver investor increases the scope of his actions and becomes wiser on making correct predictions about investments, his knowledge, when put to use, becomes a free good, in that others will mimic him to fulfill their own interests. Even those with the highest time preferences will eventually make an effort to imitate the investments of those with low time preferences to reap the same fruits that they have been unable to, and thus the process of civilization will begin to expand. Now, the reason time preference is important in this instance is that once we understand that it is an essential component to creating civilization, the government's role in undoing civilization becomes clear, as the state is dependent on the expropriation of wealth, the predation of private property, and investor saver that is subject to this will rearrange their resources as such. Firstly, As the state will lower the supply of the investor saver, this will necessarily raise his time preference. Firstly, as the state will lower the personal supply of the investor saver, this will necessarily raise his time preference, as time preference lowers as income increases. While secondly, if a saver investor knows that he could potentially be the victim of expropriation, they will reallocate their investments and resources to minimize their own predation. Say, on an individual level, the increased risk of burglary will incentivize one to buy alarms, weapons, security cameras, security guards, and so on. Thus, their time preference will only be altered temporarily, just as how the risk of natural disasters will lead people to invest in irrigation systems and shelters, etc. Moreover, only those outliers who cannot defend themselves will have their time preference lowered as the result of having a smaller supply of resources. However, when it comes to the government's use of taxation, liquidity, or government money, and other state efforts to violate individual property rights, like any other act of extortion, robbery, or destruction, the individual has no right to defend themselves. Thus, all that are subject to the state have their time preferences systematically raised as the supply of future goods is decreased through expropriation. In other words, it is when private property violations become institutionalized that time preferences lower significantly. Furthermore, in virtue of self-interest, every government will exhibit the tendency towards growth and use the wealth it expropriates to its advantage. In other words, the state is an ever-expanding source of decivilizing forces. However, let's talk about monarchism versus democracy. As was stated earlier, not all governments behave the same, and not all governments are equally barbaric. Neither is every form of government equally likely to come about. For instance, it is obvious that any institution that lends itself to expropriation must maintain a monopoly to both ensure its victims must cooperate, and also to eliminate competition that could violently overthrow them. So subsequently, in order for the state to do this, it must carve into the minds of the public a sense of legitimacy, so the masses see its predation as justice and its victims are kept defenseless. And it is for this reason that all governments begin small and gradually expand. This is why the history of states didn't start with empires or world governments. In contrast, people of a tribe or commune would only trust those they know and have democratically elected to govern them rather than the globally reaching anonymous bureaucrats we are subject to today. Moreover, a particular way this happens in any anarchic society is through elites emerging from a diversity of intelligence, skills, wealth, and ability, and the elites essentially establishing a monopoly that is considered legitimate by their peers through their excellence. Naturally, to quote Dijonel, there are men that see themselves as ascendant to others, and they will then inspire others with trust in themselves. Now, of course, the most desirable monopoly for elites and natural figures of authority is a monopoly on the judicial system, while also as these monopolies are the result of these individuals' elitist characters and achievements, it makes sense for them to ascribe some sort of ownership over these monopolies. Thus, these primordial states are monarchic. They are ruled personally and privately, which is contrasted by democratic rule, in which the state is supposedly owned publicly, yet still, the democratic politicians will act in their own self-interest. Although they do not own the state and are not seen as owning the state, they still govern personally and in their own interests. Thus, their authority is in some sense artificial. That is to say, it won't arise naturally, rather they must do so through revolutions and wars. But nonetheless, the democratic politician does not and is not seen to own the state monopoly they were elected to govern, but rather are the temporary caretakers or trustees. And this difference in public ownership, that is, democracy and private ownership or monarchy, have very different effects on time preference and thus on the state of civilization. However, in contrast to the status quo, the security of civilization fell greatly when the world transitioned from monarchy to democracy. To illustrate, the time preference of a monarch is far lower than that of a democratic politician for the fundamental reason that the wealth they expropriate is not said to be owned by everyone, but is owned individually by the monarch as a part of their estate. Thus, the monarch is entitled to selling and buying parts of his estate, while is also able to pass on his estate to his heirs. And this difference in ownership confronts the monarch with a very different set of economic incentives, as unlike the democratic politician, it is in the monarch's interest to increase his current income only if there is no proportionate drop in the value of his estate, as again, the estate is his personal property rather than something that is owned by everyone, while also as expropriating necessarily decreases its value through disincentivizing the production of those living under his rule. The monarch is faced with a far greater degree of economic calculations that's results he is privately responsible for. Thus the time preference of the monarch is far lower than that of the democratic politician. But moreover, the monarch, as any government, hinges on a parasitic relationship with the non-government public through the predation of producers. So nonetheless, the monarch must consider, if no one produces, there will be no wealth for the monarch to expropriate, while if all wealth is expropriated, there will be no wealth to expropriate in the future. Hence it is in the king's interest to tax low, as these two outcomes would substantially decrease the value of his estate. So the monarch instead seeks to expropriate a growing producing population, achieved only through lower taxes. This is easily seen through the public sector's income increasing drastically in the 19th century, the century of democracy. Prior to then, public income was only 5% of national income, while also up until the 19th century, only the United Kingdom had an income tax. And as the monarch seeks to increase the value of his estate, while also wishes to incentivize production, the judicial monopoly will be used to enforce a system of private property, enabling producers to create the wealth needed for expropriation. In fact, the monarch will want all income to be achieved productively. Hence, private property violations will be criminalized. This is echoed in the oath of the first French kings, quote, "I will honor and preserve each one of you, and I will maintain for each the law and justice pertaining to him," end quote. In fact, the King of France was referred to as the debtor of justice, and it is worth remembering that anything that is privately owned comes with the right of exclusion. Therefore, the monarch has the liberty of excluding anyone he chooses from the life of parasitism that he enjoys. Perhaps his family will be included, but the monarch has zero incentive to allow anyone to relish in the wealth expropriated from productive society, thus further minimizing the extent of state parasitism. And when it comes to the size of the king's family, the estate will be divided and inherited by who the monarch chooses, and with more family members comes a greater division of the king's lot, further incentivizing his heirs to keep his family highly exclusive, and with such an exclusive ruling class comes certain ideological circumstances. As there exists no upward mobility for the non-government public, their class consciousness is greatly enhanced. There is a clear dichotomy of the ruled and the non-ruled, with little hope for people to move from one class to the next. Hence the solidarity of the ruled tends to be vast, with very high risk of the state losing its legitimacy when the monarch oversteps the boundaries set by the public, such as excessive taxation. For this reason, it was commonplace that the king would reward and negotiate with those he ruled over, such as John the Good of France being subsidized to keep the king's treasury intact, or when kings would travel around the town assembling those he was financially reliant on, such as during the eve of the 100-Year War. In addition, although a monarchism is by no means anti-war, the financial burden of military conflict is far more endearing, while also if any war is seen by the public as not theirs, it will surely threaten the legitimacy of the ruling class. Contractual solutions to conflicts are vastly preferable, whether this be through buying land or through marriage between the ruling class of another territory. Under monarchism, expansion may involve military conflict, but it is mostly the process of contractual conjunctions between already existing independent kingdoms, as was the case under the Habsburgs of Austria, an empire that expanded into the Netherlands and the western extremities through Maximilian marrying the heirs of the Dukes of Burgundy, or his son Philip, who married the heirs of Ferdinand and Spain, moreover expanding his estate into Spanish America, the Mediterranean, and Italy, and so on. However, all of this is only the result of privately owned government. When ownership is made public, a whole array of different incentives emerge, incentives that strengthen the process of de-civilization. If we look at the democratic politician, he is free to use the state to his advantage. However, he does not own it. He cannot sell parts of it, nor can anyone inherit it from him. He has authority over the state apparatus, but he has no ownership over the capital value of it. He has the ability to use the state, but has no ownership over its capital stock. Under democracy, we are left with a dilemma. The democratic politician has no interest in maximizing the wealth of the state, nor the value of it, because he doesn't own it. But his personal income is another matter. Even if he wanted to maximize the value of the state, he could not, as the nature of public property prohibits market prices and thus economic calculation. And if you want to know more about this economic calculation problem, I do have another video on it in the description, but I'd also recommend Googling it. But anyway, the nature of public ownership is one of continuous capital consumption, as it is impossible to preserve the capital stock or increase the estate's value in any way. Additionally, unlike the king, the democratic politician, rather than owning the state, is the temporary caretaker, and thus what he does not consume now, he will not be able to consume later. So subsequently, it is in his interest to consume as many resources as possible. This, combined with the inability for the politician to reap the value of the state like under private rule, while being more than able to reap the benefits of higher income. This means the politician has little reason not to ruin his country in order to achieve a higher salary. In addition, the class consciousness of the public, non-government class is vastly diminished, as unlike under monarchism where the ruling class is highly exclusive, under democracy everyone is under the impression that they can enter the ruling class through the democratic process. Therefore, the public are under the illusion that rather than being ruled by somebody, they are ruled by themselves, an illusion that is greatly responsible for the widespread view that the transition from monarchy to democracy was progress. While also, as the ruling class becomes more inclusive, unlike under monarchism, the public are more likely to submit to heavy taxation, as the possibility of finding oneself on the receiving end of such a parasitic relationship is much greater, which also explains why the public sector has a tendency to grow and people with high time preferences are attracted to public servitude, effectively subsidizing low time preferences. Tax rates tend to rise as well as increases in the government money supply, while also all of these policies inevitably lead to ever increasing public debt. While remembering that the monarch is the private owner of an estate and is hence liable for all debts incurred, the democratic politician has no responsibility for the debts incurred by his policies. Rather, his debts are supposedly paid back in the future by equally non-liable future governments, furthermore incentivizing an increase in debt that will result in increased taxation and inflation to repay it. And with future debt, the money supply and future taxation always being expected to rise, there is heavy incentive for the public to raise their time preference and consume as many goods as quickly as they can. This is clearly observable through national debt in the Western world never being lower than 30% of national output, while frequently surpassing 100%. Secondly, this facet of democracy can really be characterized by how steadfast the newly democratic world gave up commodity money, repealing the gold standard and enabling the state to expand the money supply for no cost. As under monarchism, where commodity money was the norm, inflation or expanding the money supply was not an option, while every attempt at fiat currency under monarchism failed drastically, even over various periods from 1694 to 1821, when the Bank of England suspended specie payment, or in other words, payments on gold and silver in exchange for currency, and similar such activities by the Bank of Amsterdam and others. It all resulted in the collapse of the Dutch tulip mania in 1637 and the Mississippi bubble and the South Sea bubble in 1720. It was only under the anonymous group rule of democratic republicanism that they could achieve what the monarchs could not. That is, irredeemable paper money. While also, under monarchism, there is a wealth of evidence that the long-run trend was for prices to fall and purchasing power to rise, with the exception of war times and gold discoveries. If one turns to B.R. Mitchell's text Abstract of British Historical Statistics, published in 1962, and European Historical Statistics 1750 to 1970, published in 1978, his texts conclude that prices were substantially lower in Europe during 1760 than they were in 1660, while yet again lowering drastically in 1860 from 1760, and this trend would only come to a halt when democracy spread across Europe. In only 20 years of fiat money, the consumer price index in the US rose from 40 in 1971 to 136 in 1991. In the United Kingdom, it climbed from 24 to 157. in France from 30 to 137, and in Germany from 56 to 116. Similarly, from 1845 to the end of World War I, the money supply in Britain increased 6 times over, while in the United States from 1918 to 1991, the money supply increased by 64 times. Thus, we can see that the monarch, as the state's private owner, has a systematically longer planning horizon. His time preference is lower, and thus his degree of expropriation is also lower than the democratically elected politician or government caretaker. While the same can be said of the general public, with a larger system of systematic expropriation under democracy, the public's time preference will systematically increase, while also the monarch values the state's assets as they belong to him, while the democratic politician does not, as he is merely its caretaker for a given period of time. Thus, the monarch will not want to increase his income at the expense of his assets. However, the politician will, as firstly, the state's assets are owned publicly, and thus he is not financially responsible or liable for his decisions, while secondly, what he doesn't consume in the present, he will not be able to consume in the future, as I said earlier. While additionally, the monopoly on law maintained by a democratic bureaucracy operates very differently from one maintained by a monarch. Under monarchism, the king inherits an age-old law of private property. He does not legislate or bring new laws into existence. Rather, he occupies a privileged status within a pre-existing system of private property. With the exception of the Protestant revolutions and the Renaissance, laws were seen as something to be given rather than something to be made. However, with the rise of democracy comes the rise of positive law, laws that the state enacts not just to redistribute wealth from society onto itself, but also redistributes wealth within civil society, as again the productivity of society is of no concern to the democratic politician, and thus there is no logical obstacle stopping the democratic politicians from engaging in mass redistributionism. In fact, with the democratic politician being subject to popular elections, redistributionism becomes the necessary course of action for all democratic societies, as re-election can be easily achieved when offering greater levels of redistributionism to an ever-increasing number of non-producers whose welfare depends on you. And whether the welfare state takes its form in the confiscation of wealth from those who have for those who do not, or through expanding public industries in the nature of public goods to include education, healthcare, and so on, in all instances, they systematically heighten time preferences, simply because as the welfare state expands, those who do not produce become better off, and those that do produce become worse off. Moreover, not producing becomes a viable and attractive lifestyle, having no need to make future predictions or forgo present goods for future ones. This disincentive will become apparent for any age, race, sex, or class that is on the giving end of redistribution. However, the discriminated groups will also be disincentivized due to being punished for their productivity. Subsequently, with such a disproportionate increase in parasitism, the very problems these institutions set out to solve will become worse, less wealth will exist, everyone's incomes will fall, and society will regress to a much less civilized point. Moreover, the amount of positive legislation will increase severely under democratic rulemaking. Every year, tens of thousands of regulations are passed by parliaments on all aspects of life, both civil and commercial, further heightening time preferences with increased legal uncertainty. For instance, the 1994 edition of the Code of Federal Regulations, the annual compendium of all US federal government regulations currently in effect, consists of a total of 201 books, occupying about 26 feet of library shelf space. The code's index alone is 754 pages. The code contains regulations concerning the production and distribution of celery, mushrooms, watermelons, watch bands, the labeling of light bulbs, hosiery, parachute jumping, iron and steel manufacturing, sexual offenses on college campuses, to the cooking of onion rings made out of diced onions, and a plethora of other commodities. But to continue on time preference, one of the best measurements of the rate of time preference in a society is to observe the rate of interest, as interest rates are the ratio of how much people value money in the present compared to money in the future. To be specific, a higher interest rate means that people are more concerned with the present, while a lower interest rate means people are thinking about the future. Thus, as incomes and standards of living rise, so too will interest rates fall exponentially towards zero, without ever reaching it. As, if you remember earlier, The rise in real income follows with a fall in the marginal utility of present money relative to future money. Hence, as interest rates fall, investments and future real incomes increase. Now, how did interest rates fare under monarchism as opposed to under democracy? Well, in Sidney Homer's text, A History of Interest Rates, he writes about how minimum interest rates on normal safe loans were around 16% at the beginning of Greek financial history in the 6th century BC, and fell to 6% during the Hellenistic period, while also in Rome, minimum interest rates fell from more than 8% during the earliest period of the Republic to 4% during the 1st century of the Empire, and also in the 13th century Europe, the lowest interest rates on safe loans were 8%. However, during the 14th century, they came down to about 5%, and then in the 15th century, they fell to 4%, and then yet again in the 17th century, they went down to 3%, and at the end of the 19th century, minimum interest rates had further declined to less than 2.5%. However, in stark contrast to the age of monarchic rule, democracy has seen a period of increasing interest rates, another reflection of rising time preferences under democratic rule. For instance, the average interest rates in Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States after the First World War have never been as low as they were in the mid-19th century, with the one exception of the 1950s US. And also, minimum long-term interest rates in Europe and the US are always above 4% and thus above the interest rates of 17th century Europe, and as high or higher than rates during the 15th century. Similarly, current US savings rates of around 5% of disposable income are roughly lower than what they were more than 300 years ago in 17th century England, despite much more wealth existing today. Under the 19th century, when government income was only 5% of national output, generally half of government spending was on the military, while the other half on administration. Thus, military spending was 2.5% of national product, and similarly with administration. Welfare was considered a private issue to be handled voluntarily by private charities. Insurance was considered an individual responsibility, and thus the era of sovereign kings was vastly different to today's democracies, where the public is released from the responsibility of their own health, old age, and etc. And so too under democracy has there been a significant increase in the rates of divorce, illegitimacy, single parenting, singledom, and abortion, as the collectivizing of responsibility, as under democracy, has severe consequences on how people live. The family unit is far less valuable as a means of distributing resources, as women and children can easily survive off public assistance, and even receive benefits for being single mothers, thus incentivizing such behavior. Moreover, breaking down the bond between children, parents, and grandparents. In addition, with the introduction of public-owned government comes a difference in foreign policy, as the democratic politician does not own the state. He is not free to make contractual arrangements, such as monarchical expansion through marriage, as was mentioned before, while all disputes solved by intergovernmental treaties can be revoked at any time by future governments. So, under democracy, war and military conquest is the primary method of expanding and increasing one's tax bases, while also the monarchical wars typically arise from very different reasons than democratic ones, with the much clearer distinction between the ruling class and the public, as under monarchy, soldiers were difficult to find, as wars were typically considered the king's business to be financed by his own capital, while also his wars typically arose from disputes of inheritance and contracts as opposed to the ideological conflicts we see under democracy. For this reason, under monarchism, the distinction between combatant and citizen was much clearer. Thus, wars were very rarely targeting citizens and were considered by the rulers to be a matter of the king's personal military versus that of another king's. Additionally, the scarcity of soldiers meant their price was dear, and therefore their lives were valuable in the eyes of the king, and combat deaths ought to have been minimized. To quote Italian historian Guglielmo Ferrero, during the 1800s he wrote in the text Peace and War, quote, "War became limited and circumscribed by a system of precise rules. It was definitely regarded as a kind of single combat between the two armies, the civil population being merely spectators. Pillage, requisitions, and acts of violence against the population were forbidden in the home country as well as in the enemy country. Each army established depots in its rear in carefully chosen towns. shifting them as it moved about. Conscription existed only in the rudimentary and sporadic forms, soldiers being scarce and hard to find. Everything was done to ensure their quality by a long, patient, and meticulous training, but as this was costly, it rendered them very valuable, and it was necessary to let as few be killed as possible, having to economize their men. Generals tried to avoid fighting battles. The object of warfare was the execution of skillful maneuvers, and not the annihilation of the adversary. A campaign without battles and without loss of life, a victory obtained by a clever combination of movements, was considered the crowning achievement of this art, the ideal pattern of perfection. It was avarice and calculation that made war more humane. War became a kind of game between sovereigns. A war was a game with its rules and its stakes: a territory, an inheritance, a throne, a treaty. The loser paid, but just a proportion was always kept between the value of the stake and the risks to be taken, and the parties were always on guard against the kind of obstinacy which makes a player lose his head. They tried to keep the game in hand and to know when to stop." End quote. And this observation is highlighted through the monarchs of the Middle Ages, often solving disputes not through enlisting the civilian population, but through contractual arrangements with private mercenaries, such as the condottieri of Italian cities-states during the Renaissance, in which the captain of the mercenary army would negotiate their terms with the city-state, this including when Lucino Visconti defeated the company of St. George of Werner von Erslingen, and the Battle of Alberico da Barbiano and John Hawkwood, two mercenaries that founded their own condottieri, the Company of St. George, and reached acclaim by defeating the Breton Company of Antipope Clement VII at Marino in 1379. While in addition, these two also started privately contracted mercenary groups such as Facino Cane and Braccio da Montone. Just to name some examples, in addition to reference JFC Fuller's text, Conduct of War, where he writes on the 7-Year War, quote, "So completely was civil life divorced from war, that in a sentimental journey through France and Italy, Lawrence Sterne relates that during the 7-Year War, 1756 to 1763, he left London for Paris with so much precipitation that it never entered my mind that we were at war with France, and that on his arrival in Dover, it suddenly occurred to him he was without a passport. However, this did not impede his journey, as when he arrived at Versailles, the Duke of Choiseul, French foreign minister, had one sent to him. In Paris, he was cheered by his French admirers, and in Frontenac was invited to theatricals by the English colony." End quote. While another noteworthy quote would be by Daniel Defoe, an English writer and trader amongst other things of the 1600s, who wrote on the military tactics of his time, quote, "Often armies of 50,000 men of a side stand at bay in view of one another, and spend a whole campaign in dodging, or as it is generally called, observing one another, and then march off into winter's quarters." End quote. And similarly, Sir John Fortescue is quoted with the observation that to force an enemy to consume his own supply was much to compel him to supply his opponents, was more to take up winter quarters in his territory, was very much more. Thus, to enter an enemy's borders and keep him marching backwards and forwards for weeks without giving him a chance of striking a blow was in itself no small success. However, in stark contrast, when the ruling class is made less explicit and people begin to identify with the state more and more, wars are fought very differently. As Hans Hermann Hoppe says, there emerges in the public a mass emotional identification with large anonymous groups of people. Furthermore, this identification is strengthened through the state exploiting culture, religion, language, and history. So thus, when democratic nations go to war, in the public's eyes, it is not the ruling class's battle, as it was seen under monarchy, but a fight over identity, over religion, language, and culture, a fight for one's way of life, and because of which, those who do not want to be involved in the war become traitors. Perhaps they even become criminals when conscription is the norm. Hence, the state can much easier raise taxes for the purpose of war, as the public is much less willing to resist due to the ideological support embedded within the population. In other words, the state becomes the symbol for absolute good. From the French Revolution and Napoleon all the way into the 21st century, the commonly accepted rules of combat deviated further and further from the age of sovereign kings, in that targeting civilians, private property, and businesses became increasingly more acceptable in warfare. Moreover, with democracy and republicanism emerged conscription, and unlike under monarchism when soldiers were valuable, under conscription where citizens are coerced into fighting wars, they become cheap, as there is a much smaller fiscal cost associated with the loss of life. Therefore, the desire for the ruling class to avoid war would not only be lesser, but war would be sought out. Even when France first enacted compulsory military service during the French Revolution, the nature of war would change forever, becoming more unlimited and more fatal. In fact, so much so that by the 20th century, life was valued so little that the massacres of complete civilian population became an accepted military strategy in times of war. But now I will conclude. It is certain that democracy can be sufficiently argued against for its logical incoherence. The fact that it is very difficult to distinguish from moral relativism, and that it is the philosophy of A and B ganging up to loot C, extended to a societal level. However, upon investigating the engineering principles behind both democracy and monarchism, it is clear that the end of the age of monarchic rule was a deep regression, and the Whig view of history is false. The era of democratic rule is one of mass parasitism and murder, and an era that's conclusion will be socialism and eventually societal catastrophe. But for some final words on the matter, I'd like to quote Hans Hermann Hoppe in Democracy, the God That Failed. Quote, "In every society, as long as mankind is what it is, people who covet another man's property will exist. And some people are more afflicted by this sentiment than others, but people usually learn not to act on such feelings, or even feel ashamed for entertaining them. Generally, only a few individuals are unable to successfully suppress their desire for others' property, and they are treated as criminals by their fellow man and repressed by physical punishment. Under princely rule, only one single person, the prince, can possibly act on the desire for another man's property, and it is this which makes him a potential danger and a bad, apart from the already noted logical and economic disincentives. However, a prince is further restrained in his redistributive desires by the circumstance that all members of society have learned to regard the taking and redistributing of another man's property as shameful and immoral, and accordingly watch a prince's every action with utmost suspicion. In distinct contrast, by freeing up entry into the government, everyone is permitted to openly express his desire for other men's property. What was formerly regarded as immoral and accordingly suppressed is now considered a legitimate sentiment. Everyone may openly covet everyone else's property as long as he appeals to democracy, and everyone may act on his desire for another man's property, provided that he finds entrance into government. Hence, under democracy, everyone becomes a threat." End quote. And that's gonna do it for this video, guys. Smash that fucking like button, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you really liked it, feel free to hit me up on Patreon. I really appreciate that shit, because this video took quite a while to make. I've been talking for a fucking long time now, my throat is dry. But yeah, hit me up, boy. Oh, and just a reminder, I started a Discord, and I'll put the link to the server in the description. It's lots of fun. I used to have a lot of degenerates there, but I fucking cleared that shit out. Post some fucking Nazbol memes. It's good fun. Catch you later, everybody.
Loot the country as fast as possible, because what I don't loot now, I will not be able to loot in the future.
Hans Hermann Hoppe, Democracy, the God That Failed. And I think that